The book of Ezra can be divided into two parts. The first is chapters 1 to 6, and the second chapters 7 to 10, which is when Ezra himself actually appears in the narrative. Noticing this helps us appreciate the staggered nature of the return to Jerusalem and the land of Israel, which most scholars think happened in 4 stages. The first was an initial return led by Sheshbazzar in 538 BC under Cyrus, where construction on the temple began but was then abandoned. A second group under Darius and led by Zerubbabel and Yeshua reactivated the building work, finishing it in 515 BC. The third group under Artaxerxes and led by Ezra came quite a few years later in 458 BC. This third group established the law of Moses in the community, as we shall partly see in our reading today. Lastly, Nehemiah leads the fourth party in 445 BC, still in the reign of Artaxerxes I, and they rebuild Jerusalem and its walls and continue the work of establishing Torah. This is the historical construction which most scholars prefer, and sources for this period also include Haggai and Zechariah, which we will come to later in the month. But the combined narrative of Ezra and Nehemiah break it down slightly differently, though still into 4 stages. The first 2 stages are in Ezra, the second 2 in Nehemiah. With the arrival of Ezra in the narrative in chapter 7, we are now in stage 2. Stages 3 and 4 will be in Nehemiah. In chapter 9, it seems as though Ezra has barely been in Israel 5 minutes before he is presented with a crisis. The people, even the leaders, have been marrying foreigners, a practice known as exogamy, marrying outside one's people or tribe. This is a bit of a surprise to us because we have seen multiple instances of Israelites, especially Solomon, marrying foreigners or non-Israelites, and it did not cause the reaction that we see here. Ezra's reaction is extreme. He is appalled, a strong word meaning desolated, and sits in this state until evening. In his prayer, he says he is too ashamed and embarrassed to lift his face up to God. His initial reaction to the news was to pull out his hair and tear his robes, which Leviticus chapters 10 and 21 forbid a priest to do. Why is Ezra so horrified? Ezra's reaction and the banishing of the non-Israelite wives, together with their children, is not easy to understand. His lengthy prayer in chapter 9 looks towards the commands in the law and the community's precarious position before God, as a remnant allowed to survive and return to the land. In fact, it is because of this precarious position that the law is taken so seriously, because it was ignoring it for such a long time that got them exiled in the first place. Verse 8 really shows Ezra's view of their position. The moment of favour has been shown by the Lord is brief. He has allowed a remnant. He has granted them a little sustenance in their slavery. This is not the language of celebration, which might describe a total triumph, the warrior Yahweh smiting nations as he rides on storm clouds, completely vindicating his people and shattering massive armies. But as verse 9 goes on, they remain slaves to Persia. But God has allowed them to return nonetheless. It is a prayer of a greatly humbled people. Ezra now remembers the warnings from the prophets and the law about intermarrying with the people who polluted the land. He again in verse 13 emphasizes God's mercy, that after all their sin, God still did not punish them as much as they deserved, allowing them this remnant. But now, after all this, will they intermarry with these people who cause all these abominations? He asks at the end of verse 14 whether God will not be angry continually until they are destroyed, meaning that God would be right to do so. It is this vast strength of feeling which lies behind Ezra's reaction, the humiliation, the awareness of guilt, the awful shame of ingratitude to his merciful God expressed by this behaviour, and the justifiable fear that it would lead again to destruction. Verse 12, where Ezra has quoted the law, also makes the point about inheritance. This is why it was so important to send the children away, so that, like Ishmael and Isaac, the one might not inherit over the other. The land was given to Israel. It must be inherited by Israel, as much as they must protect it from bloodshed and idolatry and injustice. Some scholars also wonder if Malachi too is referring to this situation that Ezra finds himself in. It has been suggested that the returnees from exile who came with their wives and children had divorced their Hebrew wives to marry non-Israelites, possibly because the non-Israelites were better off and well established in the land, that is, higher in society. The Hebrew wives were divorced rather than kept on because the man could not afford to keep both. After they had made the agreement to divorce the wives, Ezra withdraws and fasts. This is similar to Moses fasting 40 days and nights after the golden calf incident, as seen in Exodus 34:28 and Deuteronomy 9:18. It ends somewhat abruptly with this being carried out. It is done in an orderly way, with leaders sitting down to investigate the cases. As difficult as this decision must have been, it shows a deep resolve under Ezra's leadership to be the kind of people who can live in this special land, who will not spurn the grace shown them by their ever-loving and patient God.